Hello, my name is Jerry Brown. I'm a founding professor of anthropology here at Florida International University and the instructor for this course on psychedelics and culture. Today, I would like to share with you what, in my humble opinion, are 10 major landmarks in the study of psychedelics and culture. Number one, 1938, the discovery of LSD by chemist Albert Hofmann at the Sandoz Labs in Basel, Switzerland. Hoffman was experimenting with this 25th ergot, this fungal substance, to see if it had medical benefits. It did not. But 5 years later, in 1943, he was irresistibly drawn back to pull it off the shelf and try it again. And that's when he had his famous bicycle day experience, the first naive LSD trip in the world. And he realized he was dealing with a very powerful substance. Eventually, as LSD came into the world, Hoffman saw this as his problem child. In fact, he wrote a book called LSD, My Problem Child. But over the years, he and Sandoz had sent the LSD out to different laboratories around the world, different psychiatric centers. And one of the places it ended up with was in the hands of Stanislav Grof, a Freudian psychiatrist at that time. In his very first LSD session, because Grof tried it on himself, he had a cosmic consciousness experience that was so profound that it caused him to reject the Freudian approach and to develop the field of LSD psychotherapy. And Grof has done 60 years of research and work in this field, written up in his book, The Way of the Psychic. As he spread out culturally, Hoffman eventually called LSD my problem child. In fact, he wrote a book calling it My Problem Child. Grof later on said, yes, LSD is not a problem child. It's a child prodigy born into a dysfunctional family. And now I would say, looking at the psychedelic renaissance, that the psychedelic renaissance has provided good family therapy for this problem child as we begin to see it develop medical and scientific benefits. Number two, 1950s, R. Gordon Wasson's discovery of a living magic mushroom cult in Mexico. In 1953, Gordon Wasson, who was then still a banker with J.P. Morgan, traveled down to Huautla de Jimenez in Oaxaca in southern Mexico and found his way to an eminent Mazatec shamaness and wise woman, Maria Sabina, who invited him to participate in her psilocybin mushroom veladas. Wasson had a life-altering experience that let him move backwards and forward in time to see, as the natives said, to see God. And he wrote this up in an article in Life magazine, then one of the most popular magazines in the world, putting Maria Sabina's photograph there and talking about the incredible power and his discovery as the first white outsider to participate in a living magic mushroom cult. Due to the publicity in Life magazine, people descended from Europe, from the United States, from Latin America, on Huautla, seeking the magic mushroom experience. And this caused great hardship for Maria Sabina and the Mazatec community, and raises these issues about what should be the interaction between outsiders and these indigenous communities. But this was truly a catalyst for the 1960s psychedelic movement because it brought these indigenous practices out into the world. Number three, 1960s and 1970s, Gordon Wasson establishes the academic study of ethnomycology, how people use mushrooms, through a series of erudite, well-documented, and lavishly illustrated books that became seminal studies in the field. 1957, Mushroom, Russia, and History, co-authored with his wife, Valentina Wasson, which define the seminal concepts of cultures that are microfields, that love mushrooms like the Slavs and the Russians, and other cultures like the Anglos and the Americans that have a phobia towards mushrooms and the fungal world. 1968, his masterpiece, Soma, Divine Mushroom of Immortality, in which Gordon Wasson identified the red and white iconic mushroom as the Soma of the Hindu Rig Veda, the enigmatic plant juice god of the Hindu Rig Veda. He also identified the Amanita mushroom shamanic tradition among the reindeer herders of Russia, Siberia, Central Russia, near the Finnish border, who he called the father, who became known to anthropologists because of his research as the fathers of shamanism, due to the use of the Amanita muscaria in their religious rituals. 1974, Maria Sabina and her Mazatec mushroom Ilada, in which Wasson recorded the chants that Maria Sabina sang during the mushroom healing ceremonies. These were eventually put out by Folkway Records as a CD, along with liner notes that had her Mazatec chants translated side by side into Spanish and English. Wasson said that preserving this tradition was the most important work he had ever done. And in 1978, working with Albert Hofmann and classical scholar, the scholar of classical languages, expert in Greek language, Carl Rook, The Road to Eleusis, Unveiling the Secret of the Mysteries, Identifying the Kykeon, the secret potion of the Greek Eleusinian mysteries, which were practiced for 2,000 years, from about 1500 BC until the 4th century, when Christianity became the official religion of the Roman Empire and Eleusis was destroyed as a pagan site. Wasson, Rook, and Hoffman identified an LSD-like fungus as the psychoactive ingredient that the ancient Greeks took as one of the seminal experiences of their life. And what Hoffman said later on could become a model for a modern Eleusis should psychedelics be reintegrated into contemporary culture. Number 4, transformational psychedelic initiations that not only transformed people's individual lives, but had a vaster impact on the culture. 1960, Timothy Leary, Cuernavaca, Mexico, magic mushrooms. Leary says he learned more in the 5 hours of that mushroom experience about the human mind and about psychology than he did in 15 years of study. He went on to found, with 2 other scholars, the Harvard Psilocybin Project, and eventually got kicked out of Harvard for violating the agreement and giving psilocybin to undergraduate students. But Leary then took on the mission and became the high priest of the acid generation and is greatly responsible for the cultural diffusion of LSD throughout Europe and the United States. 1961, Michael Harner, an anthropologist at the New School for Social Research in New York, goes to the Amazon and among the Conibo, ingests ayahuasca and has a near-death experience. He survives. He relates it to the other shamans among the Conibo, who tell him that he's been called to shamanism. Harner leaves eventually his prestigious teaching position and goes out to become a teacher of shamanism and founding a shamanic institute to spread the word about these ancient teachings. 1962, Walter Pankey, a graduate student in Leary's psilocybin project at Harvard, conducts an experiment. It's called the Good Friday experiment. It's done in the chapel at Boston University, at Marsh Chapel. And he takes 2 groups of graduate students One is given psilocybin, one is given a placebo, and 9 out of the 10 Protestant divinity students who are given the psilocybin have a full-blown mystical experience. Houston Smith was one of those students who went on to become a famous teacher and writer of religious studies. He said it was the most powerful cosmic homecoming that he ever had, and that now he truly understood what he had been reading about in the Bible all of his life. 1969, number 5, the Woodstock Music Festival at Yasgar's farm in New York. This is a time when 500,000 people came together. It was a defining moment of the counterculture. It led to a great celebration of psychedelics and a diffusion of psychedelics. And it combined and enhanced the cyclotron of the protest movements that were going on in the 1960s, the civil rights movement, the Vietnam movement, the free speech movement, the counterculture movement. And it was reinforced and spawned acid rock and folk rock, the likes of Bob Dylan, Joan Baez, Jimi Hendrix, Grateful Dead, Jefferson Airplane, and many, many others, including Jimi Hendrix's iconic performance at Woodstock of deconstructing the Star-Spangled Banner, and also in Purple Haze, asking if he could be excused while he kissed the sky. And that music was a pervasive soundscape and environment for everything that was going on in the 1960s. And Woodstock was certainly ground zero for that counterculture. Number 6, 1970, President Richard Nixon passes the Controlled Substances Act that makes most of the known psychedelics, LSD, psilocybin, and many others, Schedule 1, no redeeming medical value, and things that you can be in prison for. What happens now in this hysteria in which Nixon condemned Leary as the most dangerous man in America is that all of the clinical research that had gone on these promising substances, LSD, psilocybin, others, with addiction, with criminal recidivism, with depression, this research happens in the 1940s, 1950s, early 60s, over 1,000 peer-reviewed papers published on 40,000 human subjects. All of this gets blown away in the anti-drug hysteria of that era. Later on, before his death, one of Nixon's 2 top aides, John Ehrlichman, who went to jail after the Watergate trials, confessed that they knew that these drugs were not dangerous. They passed this act as a solution for 2 political problems. 1, they had an anti-war movement. 2, they had a civil rights movement. They could not make it illegal to protest, and they certainly couldn't make it illegal to be Black. So instead, they passed this repressive drug legislation that allowed the Nixon administration, state police, local police, to raid, infiltrate, monitor, arrest the leaders of these movements, and have a devastating impact on them. This has been most oppressive in the Black and brown communities, where higher percentages of those populations have been imprisoned under these laws. And also, as we all know, that once you're convicted as a felon, you lose your voting rights. 1970, a conversation occurs across the disciplines. This becomes number 7 of our landmarks. This is a conversation that takes place between botanist Richard Evans Schultes and anthropologist Weston LeBar. And Schultes asked, why are there so many psychedelic plants used in the New World, North America and South America, about 80 to 100, versus the Old World, where there are only 5 or 6 in use? Same climate areas, larger landmass in the Old World, longer in habitation. And Weston LeBar comes back with a cultural reply, a cultural solution to this statistical anomaly. And he says it's because the Eurasian peoples who migrated across the Bering Land Bridge during the last ice age lost their access to Amanita muscaria, which was central to their religion, and searched for substances, ayahuasca, peyote, psilocybin mushrooms, that could provide that portal to the divine, that transport to the overworld, the underworld, the meeting of the ancestors that was so central to shamanism. However, in the old world, with the coming of monotheism, Islam, Judaism, Christianity, psychedelics, and these sacred practices were suppressed as vestiges of paganism. Number 8, the Johns Hopkins School of Medicine, pioneering psilocybin studies. Starting in 2006 and 2008, under the direction of Roland Griffiths, known as the grandfather of the psychedelic renaissance, Johns Hopkins got permission and conducted a series of clinical studies that showed that psilocybin was safe to take, was non-harmful, could be very beneficial, and have lasting mood enhancement effects in a therapeutic setting. In 2016, Johns Hopkins conducts its landmark psilocybin cancer study, in which it shows that high-dose psilocybin in 1 or 2 sessions with people with advanced cancer could, in 70% of the cases, reduce anxiety, reduce depression, and reduce or eliminate fear of death. The people who experienced this said this was one of the most profound experiences of their life and one of the most profound spiritual experiences of their life. And what is fascinating here is that the researchers at Johns Hopkins found that the more intense the mystical experience brought on by these psychedelic substances, the greater the effectiveness of the psychedelic therapy. By 2019, Johns Hopkins establishes the first center for psychedelic and consciousness research at a major US university, and they have now published over 60 peer-reviewed articles on this subject and are sort of a lighthouse for researchers in the United States and around the world who become part of this psychedelic renaissance, showing the ever-increasing documentation of benefits attributed to LSD, to psilocybin, to ketamine, to ibogaine, to ecstasy, for alleviating psychological conditions. Number 9, at Imperial College, we're seeing the birth of the new science of brain neuroimaging. And under the direction of Robin Carhart Harris, using MRI studies, the researchers have been able to show visually the human brain before and after LSD, the human brain before and after psilocybin. Many of you, you're probably too young to remember, but in the 1970s, Nancy Reagan conducted, the wife of President Reagan, this Just Say No campaign. And one of the iconic ads that was all over the television at that time was 2 eggs, this is your brain, and 2 eggs in a frying pan, this is your brain on drugs. Well, now we can see your brain, and here's your brain on LSD. And what you see in these imagings is that the brain lights up, many chambers of the brain, multiple neural pathways that are not activated in what Carhart Harris has called the brain's normal default mode network. Sort of think of it as the software that's in the default mode on your computer before you add on all of these apps and all of these other different programs. It's a poor analogy, but what happens essentially is that multiple neural pathways are opened up that allow the brain to reorganize, to solve problems in different ways, to see and process trauma in a way that people can transcend it. First responders, veterans, able to use ayahuasca to objectively look at a trauma that was too painful to explore under any other therapeutic modality. So we have now gotten a real tool to explore the unconscious. Number 10, in 2020, the decriminalization and legalization movements in the United States. What we've seen is decriminalization of either psilocybin or of all sacred plants taking place in the cities of Denver, Oakland, Santa Cruz, Ann Arbor, and Washington, D.C. And we've seen a legalization initiative for psilocybin for medical purposes that passed on the ballot in Oregon during the presidential election by 56% of the vote. And it was approved that under medical conditions, psilocybin could be administered to people 21 years or older at a doctor, a psychiatrist recommendation. And so now we see a whole group of people who are being trained at institutes, at universities, to become therapists who work with psychedelic therapy. And this will be a burgeoning industry as more and more legalization and more decriminalization. We've also seen for the Native American communities, the legalization of peyote in the Native American church, which happened years ago, and also more recently, ayahuasca in the Santo Daime and UDV, Unidade Vegetal, segments of the Brazilian-based ayahuasca churches. And all of this has been confirmed and approved and reinforced under the federal 1993 Religious Freedom Restoration Acts, which allows the use of psychedelic substances and sacred plants if you can show a historic religious use and tradition. Well, that's it, landmarks 1 through 10, and this concludes our survey of 10 landmarks in the study of psychedelics and culture. Perhaps by the end of this course, you'll find other landmarks to add to this list. And maybe, just maybe, 10 years from now, some student studying psychedelics in the future will be reading about your discovery on this landmarks list. But for that to happen, you're going to have to ask the big questions, because all great science starts with a question.